You're listening to Bloomberg Businessweek with Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody. He's not necessarily a rebel. I don't know about that. We'll talk about that. But he is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of Devil's Bargain, Steve Bannon, Donald Trump, and the Storming of the Presidency. His new book takes a look at the other side of the political spectrum, chronicling the rise of economic populism in the Democratic Party in the wake of the global financial crisis and collapse, if you will, in 2008. This plays a big role, if you will, in terms of his thinking and in the book.
The new book, I got it in my hand right here. It's called The Rebels, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, AOC, and the Rise of the New Left. Very pleased to have back with us our colleague Josh Green. He's Businessweek national correspondent. He's here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Josh, talk about timing. We're going to get to the book in just a second.
Like the new year, we're going to come in.
We're going to get to the book in just a second. But first, the breaking news about Chris Christie exiting the race. He's actually caught disparaging Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis as he exited the race. You wrote a big profile of Chris Christie back at the end of last year, August of 2021, I should say, talking about how he's absolutely, totally, 100% anti-Trump for now. From the beginning, it was a long shot presidential candidate, but let's get your reaction.
Yeah, I mean, to me, Christie was always kind of the most interesting guy in the race. Always going to be a long shot, but, blunt, obnoxious, unafraid to kind of speak truth to power, and just from a kind of a journalistic standpoint, super entertaining guy and fun to be around. So I actually went out and traveled with him. I was in New Hampshire, South Carolina, kind of watching how people reacted to him. And I got to be honest, even then, you could tell what his problem was going to be. He'd have these town hall events, and people would flock to them, and I'd go talk to them after, and like half of them were Democrats. Like the problem is the appeal that Chris Christie has is not to hardcore Republican primary voters. It's to people who don't like Donald Trump. And yes, that's a narrow sliver of Republican voters, but what it mostly was kind of aggrieved Democrats who liked to hear a Republican beating on Trump.
Who'd have thunk or did you think when you wrote your first book that, Donald Trump, was he just going to be kind of a one-off, or was he going to be something that was so pivotal to the Republican Party and really such a part of, I feel like, every political conversation?
I mean, by the time I wrote my first book, 2017, Devil's Bargain, was about the rise of Trump and Bannon in that campaign. Trump was in the White House, and it was pretty clear, like, to me anyway, this wasn't going to be a one-off thing. I mean, Trump and Trumpism are here to stay. I mean, whether or not he avoided, indictment or this or that, or could like win re-election, I think was and is an open question. But such a powerful force of personality, you could see already the way he's dominating Republican politics in a way that's made it just impossible so far for challengers, including Chris Christie, to knock him off his throne.
Is it just the personality? What is it? Because I was trying to think, is there somebody of another politician, in our lifetime that obviously maybe didn't cause what some would say the chaos, but was also just so charismatic and just had that personality?
In a very, very different way, I think Barack Obama did for Democrats. I mean, it was almost like this kind of religious ecstasy when you would go to Obama events when he was first running, even back when he was still a senator, and people were just so excited about that. It's a similar phenomenon when you go to Trump events, that this is, the people in the crowd think this is not just another politician. This is someone special, and being here, seeing them as like some kind of a quasi-mystical experience. There have been others, but it's really, really rare.
Josh, if we are to make comparisons to your first book, Devil's Bargain, about Trump and about Steve Bannon, together with this book, which is about sort of the same thing happening on the left, the first thing that comes to mind for me is that Republicans have been so much more successful, it seems like, in embracing the extremist portion of their party. That is the Donald Trump wing of the party. I mean, look, Mike Johnson is speaker, for example.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I think, look, when Trump's version of right-wing populism was so intrinsically appealing to Republican voters that, like, it took over the party in the span of a month. I mean, I remember actually traveling, down to the border with Trump and Bannon when he was first running. And at the time, he was still this kind of controversial, quasi-crazy seeming guy who seemed like he'd be a fun news cycle, maybe a flash in the pan. And then like a month later, he's dominating Republican polls and he's never looked back. Not quite the same experience on the left. I mean, there was definitely a similar populist phenomenon in the sense that there really was this left-wing backlash to Obama in the financial crisis among Democratic voters. You could see it in the rise of Warren, and you could especially see it in the rise of Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign in 2015. He, too, really kind of caught fire and suddenly had these big national audiences, somewhat in the way Trump did with Republicans, but he never took over the entirety of the Democratic electorate, the Democratic Party, in the way that Trump did on the Republican side.
We're talking with Josh Green, his new book out, The Rebels, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the struggle for a new American politics. What's interesting, Josh, is I feel like so many conversations we still have around this table, political or other, business, we talk about the pandemic impact, right? And kind of where we are, where we were, and how it continues to affect us as a society. But the 2008 financial crisis is such a crucial part of your book. And I think you write one event that shaped recent American politics more than any other. Talk to us about the importance of that event and how it continues to shape us.
I mean, so to me, as a kind of middle-aged Washington reporter / author historian who's been on the scene for a while, the 2008 financial crisis is the tectonic event in modern American politics. And it was clear at the time it was going to be a big deal, but I don't think we understood the aftershocks from that earthquake. And you could see it initially in the rise of the Tea Party movement and Occupy Wall Street, both of which I covered. You could see it in the rise of the populist right, Donald Trump, Steve Bannon, outlets like Breitbart News, the way that took over the Republican Party. But what interested me for this book was that there was really a similar phenomenon on the left. And like the one on the right, I think it really stemmed from economic issues, and that broad sense of anger and economic dislocation, not just from the crash, but from the austerity and job loss that followed in the recovery. That really shaped American politics in 2016. Weirdly enough, the book is kind of bookended by a second economic crisis, the COVID crash. But what's happened since then, I think, has been less economic driven and more cultural driven. And partly that's because Trump and Biden both instituted a very successful economic response to the COVID crash. Big stimulus, all kinds of middle class support.
It wasn't just Wall Street; it was also Main Street.
It was more Main Street than Wall Street this time around. And I think you see that in the robust economic numbers we're seeing today. But rather than have Americans be super happy and gratified and eager to reelect Joe Biden, instead the big political fight is shifted onto cultural terrain. And COVID really drove that with mask mandates and vaccines. And Trump and Democrats fighting and Anthony Fauci, and that's where we are today. Economically better off, but still as Americans kind of angry in each other's throats.
Do you think in any world, Josh, there could be a singular candidate who could unite both populist wings of each party?
I used to, but I really don't.
Because of the cultural stuff,
Because of
right?
the cultural angle, yeah. I mean, look, you can look today at Donald Trump's policies and at Joe Biden's policies, and on economics, there's real populist overlap. Biden kept Donald Trump's tariffs. And a lot of the things,
China policy,
China policy, right?
Yeah.
Trump for his entire presidency said, this is going to be infrastructure week. This is going to be infrastructure week. It never was, but Joe Biden got a lot of that passed and instituted. So there are certainly areas of overlap on economics, but as you said, culturally, I think the two parties are farther apart than ever.
If the 2008 financial crisis hadn't happened, where might we be politically? Would we have seen this wave of populism?
I can't imagine that we would have. Because to me, I mean, my analysis, doing all the reporting and all the kind of historical digging I did for the Rebels, was that we've seen this kind of populist backlash before, after the Great Depression in the 1940s. But if there hadn't been a crash in 2008, I don't know what event would have been there to kind of generate that backlash. Maybe it would have been maybe it would have been about something else. Who knows?
Yeah.
But I don't think it would have been an economic populist backlash.
And would then Donald Trump have made his way to the White House?
Boy, it's
I know
hard.
it's like all
It's funny. It's hard for me to imagine he would, but I wouldn't rule it out because Trump is such a natural entertainer. Not to go off on too big a digression. In the last book, Devil's Bargain, about the rise of Trump, I did a big chapter on how Trump, when he was on TV, had huge appeal to black audiences, to minority audiences. They loved The Apprentice. So I could imagine an alternate universe in which Trump had run as this kind of bipartisan, centrist entertainer, celebrity figure who just got everybody excited and united the country. But that obviously is not the world we've wound up in.
I mean, what is so wild at the end of the day is Trump is hardly the picture of the populist who he is set to appeal to. I mean, this is a guy who's
Is
inherited
it Trump
money.
Tower or Mar-a-Lago?
Exactly. He's, flies on private jets everywhere, calls himself a billionaire. Whether that's true or not can be debated. Hey, speaking of characters, I want to get to a couple of the characters that you highlight in The Rebels. Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the struggle for a new American politics. Your new book that came out yesterday. I want to go to AOC because it was such a shock in 2018 when she ended up beating Crowley in the Democratic primary and essentially becoming the new face of, at least for young Democrats out there, progressive politics. What is her future in the party?
Boy, it's a good question. I mean, she's such an interesting narrative thread in the book because you can trace her genesis from the Occupy Wall Street movement. Like a lot of the people that surrounded her and helped organize that original campaign to knock off Joe Crowley and got her elected were Occupy Wall Street veterans. And so you can trace a line from that economic discontent on the left to her congressional career. I think the path forward for her is really tough to see because she doesn't strike me as someone, at least not right now, who could really hope to win statewide office in New York, senator, governor. I think she's coded as kind of being too radical.
Oh, that's interesting.
I do. So the obvious path forward to me, and she's kind of hinted and alluded at this, might be in the future in 2028. Maybe she runs for president as kind of a Bernie Sanders style factional Democratic candidate. Certainly she would be the one that would stand to inherit that mantle and that movement if that's what she decided to do. But I think she's still trying to figure out what exactly she wants to accomplish. And I think whether or not Joe Biden wins and how that win or loss is interpreted after the fact will do a great deal to kind of shape the world in which she's going to have to run if she decides that that's what she wants to do.
What's important in terms of the world, and I think about our audience who are listening and watching, understand about Elizabeth Warren and her role in all of this?
I think really that she is the one that helped shift the Washington Democrats in the direction of this kind of Democratic populism. Bernie Sanders had been around saying these sort of things like since I was a little boy, and nobody really listened to it before 2008. He
old, like exactly,
he viewed as kind of a gadfly, But Warren came in and very skillfully used her platform first as the TARP oversight cop, the kind of bailout before she was in the Senate, just to shift the whole public conversation. I mean, I have a long chapter in The Rebels about how Warren kind of came on the scene and was one of the first people in Washington to leverage YouTube and social media to help shape media coverage. She was a darling of Jon Stewart and The Daily Show back when that was the show that everybody watched. And it really helped change what the Democratic electorate cared about and talked about in a way that forced Democratic politicians to respond. So I think she's been instrumental in kind of shaping the broader contours of the modern Democratic Party, even though she ran for president in 2020 and lost.
How much does Joe Biden, you think, listen to her?
I think he listens to her a lot. I mean, all you have to do is look at a list like the roster of who's staffing the upper echelons of his administration. A lot of them are Elizabeth Warren people. And I talked to a former Biden official in the book, very much a centrist, not a lefty, who said, look, Warren and Sanders were not controversial people in Joe Biden's White House. We spent all our time worrying about Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, the centrists who gave Biden so much headache. So I think that's a good measurement of just how far the Democratic Party has shifted in this left populist direction, at least on economics.
Hey, Josh, we got 40 seconds left. What happens to the rebels if Joe Biden loses?
Boy, that's a great question. I think that it will discredit in the public's eyes, or certainly in the Democratic political world's eyes, a lot of what they've done. And I think it will present a real problem for Democrats moving forward. Because if you just look at the raw economic numbers we see today, it's really been a remarkable recovery in America from that COVID crash. So a lot to be said, I think, on behalf of robust government response to kind of recessions, things like that. But if Biden loses and it's attributed to high inflation and government spending and the policies of people like Warren, Bernie, and AOC, then I think most Democrats are going to reject that going forward, the same way that Democrats rejected Jimmy Carter and his brand of politics in the 1980s.
Incredible.
It's so wild, given that the policies aren't that removed from one another. It's the cultural stuff.
History is so contingent. Yeah.
Great stuff. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Appreciate all the time. Of course, Bloomberg Businessweek national correspondent Josh Green. His new book is The Rebels, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, AOC, and the rise of the new left, really the struggle for a new American politics.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek. Tim Stenovec and Carol Massar live in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio in New York.